Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Better Futures Australia webinar, part 3 on today's corporate and finance sector engagement program. I'm Monica Richter from WWF Australia, and before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous elders, past and present, whose lands we are all on. I'm on the Gadigal, Bidjigal and Gwegal lands of the Eora Nation and Darug Nation here in Wallai Creek in Sydney. Feel free if you want to acknowledge the lands that you're on in the chat. So I work in WWF Australia as a senior manager in the Low Carbon Futures program. I work on a couple of programs, one the Science-Based Targets Initiative, getting companies to set science-based aligned, Paris-aligned commitments, and also the Business Renewables Centre, helping companies and councils and other organisations to commit to large-scale power purchase agreements. We're also a member of Better Futures Australia. I'm very happy to be here today. So the purpose of Better Futures Australia is to engage climate champions from all walks of life, providing hope and inspiration to others, to support working groups for connections, case studies, examples, encourage peer support and provide a platform to demonstrate society-wide support. So we sort of start to normalise the idea that we're all acting together. And I wanted to give a little bit, before we introduce the speakers, to give a little bit of a summary of the last couple of sessions we've had this morning. So this morning we had a gallop through what was happening internationally with some excellent speakers from Claire O'Neill, who was the Glasgow COP Conference of the Parties, is now working for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I think one of the key messages she came back with was the importance of powerful partnerships, the private-public partnerships, and also how important the Climate Change Act and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has really driven increases in transparency and governance. And we'll touch on some of those today. We had Dean Blekic from the COP26 Climate Champions team and part of Mission 2020, and he talked about the ambition and the appetite for ambition. And Emily Keretz, who's the marketing director for CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, talking about the traction taking place in the financial markets and how they're driving that change. So it was very, it was a very interesting conversation, that international piece. And Erwin Jackson, he chaired our lunchtime event, and we had Michael Lord from Beyond Zero Emissions. Of course, they've launched their 1 Million Jobs program. So again, the message was about transformation across different industry sectors, energy, manufacturing, retrofitting buildings. Had Janelle Burston from Wesfarmers talk about TCFD and what impact that's had on the business. And she said, one of the quotes, the cost of inaction will be far greater than the cost of action. And that was one of the findings that the company had through just going through that Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure project, which was also really interesting to hear. And then we had Akash Sachdeva from HESTA. So he's, representing the investors and how important it is for those investors. And he said one of the insights was that the investors are starting to ask all the same questions of the companies. And with that engagement model, really opening up dialogue and working together to progress greater ambition because of the risks. And I think the other story he talked about was the level of innovation that is going on in corporate Australia. So here we have four excellent speakers who are going to be talking about the opportunities to drive that level of ambition forward. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, is going to be John Dee. John Dee is the Australian Director of RE100, Renewable Energy 100, which is a global initiative, and I'd be really welcoming John to the podium, virtual podium, to speak. So, John Dee, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica, and hello from Katoomba, or is in the Gundungurra language, Kadumba. And so if anyone is watching from the Gundungurra people, I'd like to acknowledge your elders and your current leaders, past, present, and future. So let's talk about RE100. What I want to do today is kind of take you through, we've only got 10 minutes, so it's going to have to be a quick presentation. Basically, the organization was RE100 as an initiative was started by the Climate Group and CDP. I head up the Do Something Foundation in Australia, and we are the delivery partner for RE100 here. So I'm running the RE100 initiative over in Australia. What's unique about RE100 is that basically it was started in partnership with two major corporates. We started it in partnership with IKEA and Swiss Re. And the whole idea of RE100 is actually very simple. The idea is to get really major companies together, get them to commit to sourcing 100% of their electricity from renewable energy sources, commit to that publicly, and then report on an annual basis on how they're moving towards achieving that 100% renewables target. Now, what's unique about RE100, I guess, is that we have some really major businesses and major brand names around the world involved. And what's unique is that they're not just well known, they've already got to 100%. So if you look, for example, at Microsoft, they've already gone 100% renewable and they're one of our members. Mars, you've either had a Mars bar or you've got pet food, or there's so many different products they make. Again, they've gone 100%. They're one of our members. So is Google. We've all done a Google search. Apple, I've just got the new iPhone. So many people now use Apple. There's 1.4 billion people around the world using an Apple product now. And of course, Lego. If you've had kids, you've trodden on Lego at some point and sworn. But the bottom line is all these people are companies that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, like many of our members. And these companies have already gone 100% renewable with their electricity use. At the moment, we have 268 globally influential companies that have committed to source all of their electricity from renewable energy sources. So it's the single largest corporate renewable energy initiative in the world. And as I'll show you in this presentation, our members are together getting some very major results. Now, here is this is most of the logos. We've actually got to the point where it's nearly impossible now to get all the logos on one page, but I'll take you through some of the companies and brands that we've got on board. If you look at car companies, we've got BMW, General Motors, and Tata. Online companies like Facebook, eBay, and Google. With beverage companies, we've got Pepsi, Diageo, Carlsberg, Anheuser-Busch, InBev, which is Budweiser amongst one of their brands. We have HP, Dell, Sony, Philips, Panasonic, Intel, Microsoft, and Apple. On the consumer brand side, we've got people like Unilever, Nestle, Nike, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, Kellogg's, Lego, and as I said earlier, Mars. And on the major chain side of things, we have people like Walmart, Target, Tesco, Woolworths in Australia, and Starbucks. And then you've got BT, Mobile, Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone on the communication front. Lots of really major banks as well, like HSBC, Wells Fargo, Barclays, Visa, MasterCard. So we've got some really major organizations that have made that 100% renewables commitment. Now, in terms of the kind of companies and the scale of it, one of our recent members shows a really positive move that we've been having in that we have some really major energy users. So our single biggest energy using member is Walmart, but TSMC joined us a number of weeks ago, and they're using 13 terawatt hours of power a year. And they've just done what I understand to be the world's biggest PPA. So we're getting companies that are coming on board. And of course, TSMC works with Apple. So we have a lot of companies coming on board who have existing relationships with other RE100 companies. And what's great about RE100 is how all the companies kind of collaborate, share information, and help each other along. So it's actually a really, really inspiring corporate initiative where people help each other. So who has joined up in Australia? We've now been going 2 years in Australia, and I've been running it during that time. And so our first year's target was to get the big 5 Australian banks on board. So I'm very glad to say that we got Westpac, CommBank, ANZ, NAB, Macquarie on board. And of course, we had Bank Australia. They're very ethical, sustainable bank. And they were the first of our members to get to 100% renewable. So we wanted to send a message that from a financial point of view, it makes a lot of sense to go renewable. And so getting the big 5 banks on board was a key target. Since then, of course, you might have seen last week, Woolworths Group joined us. They use 1% of Australia's energy. And so they came on board last week. We got a lot of media coverage with that. Also had a lot of media coverage, of course, with Atlassian. Mike Cannon-Brookes, the co-founder and co-CEO of Atlassian, is one of our fantastic ambassadors. He's very vocal in his support for RE100. And we also have other major brands like Suncor, Mirvac, Dexter's QBE, Interactive, and Bingo Industries. And I'm glad to say at the end of this week, we have just had another really big energy using company who use 1.3 terawatt hours of power a year has just joined, and we're hoping to announce them by the end of this week. That will be our first big industrial member of RE100. I can't wait to tell you about that. That's going to be exciting. But if you add up the combined market cap of the members of RE100, that just the Australian members alone, it comes to about $470 billion. So our membership also represents a big amount of clout on the ASX as well. And if you look at those international companies that I mentioned, we have about 80 of those companies that are international, that have international headquarters, that have operations here in Australia. So they're also helping to drive demand. If you add up the Australian-only owned businesses in Australia that have joined RE100, those 14 companies, soon to become 15, they are using 4.5 terawatt hours of power a year between them, all now committed to going 100% renewable. Now, if you look at the the amount of money that's going to have to be spent by our members to go 100% renewable is going to be about $98 billion US. So we're operating in 140 markets worldwide, and as you can see here, we've got about combined revenues about $6.6 trillion, and between them they're using 281 terawatt hours of power every single year. So we're actually using more power now than Australia, but don't tweet that yet. We're going to announce that at the end of the week. So we already have dozens of companies that have gone 100% renewable around the world. 2028 is the average year where our members are going to reach their 100% goals, and about 75% of companies have set 2030 as the latest date by when they're going to go 100%. One of the things next week, if you're interested, we are starting, hence this newsroom background behind me, we are launching, I used to have my own TV show on Sky News. So I'm going to be interviewing the really big members of RE100 that have already gone 100% to pass on our learnings from our members. So this is Lisa Jackson, the head of sustainability, social and issues at Apple. She's a vice president. And I've just interviewed her to get Apple to tell us, how did they go 100% renewable? How have they managed to go out and get 70 of their suppliers to agree to go 100% renewable as well? So if you are interested, I'll give you my details at the end. We'll tell you how to join. Now, just to wrap up, one of the things I want to do also is show you that a lot of companies now are starting to talk about why they're going renewable. They're starting to put it into TV ads. One of our members here in Australia is Carlton and United Breweries. And I thought for a bit of fun, I'll show you the TV ad they did for last year's AFL Grand Final. And so I think it's important that one of the reasons I show you this is that some of our members have said, it's not just about becoming renewable and helping the environment. It keeps your staff committed to the company. It means that you're sharing the values that your staff have. And I also think it's a good way of communicating to stakeholders that you're serious about sustainability and climate change. And so I'm just going to quickly show you this video that Carlton and United Breweries did for VB.
When we clock on, it's there, ready to squeeze the sweat from our burnt brows. While we're trying to earn our bacon, it's trying to turn us into it. Oh, but times are changing. Soon the sun will be working for us, because in 2020, VB will be brewed with 100% solar. So next time the sun is making you hot, just remember that it'll also be making you a cold one.
There we we go. So that's that. Now, as I said, I promised my contact details. So if you are interested in getting more information or seeing the Lisa Jackson webinar interview next week, here are my details: 0414 971 900, or email me at re100@dosomething.net.au. And back to you, Monica.
Thank you very much, John. Very inspiring to hear the progress that has been made in Australia. You're not going to share with us that the next little tidbit, so we'll have to watch your Twitter feed on Friday to see what's going to transpire in terms of the industrial company coming on board. But, you know, I think it's just terrific to see the progress that's been made in just the short years that you've been going. So next I'd like to introduce Ryan Svensson, who is the Head of Sustainable Development at Officeworks. And, you know, Officeworks have made some pretty significant announcements recently. I'm very keen to hear a little bit more about the journey that's been undertaken there, Ryan, because I'm sure many of us shop at Officeworks for our kids' school equipment. So, you know, for kitting themselves up to go to school at the beginning of the year, and our various offices. So great, over to you, Ryan. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica. Hello, everyone. I'll just get myself set up here. Sorry. Okay, great. Well, I'd also like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land we're on, and elders past, present and emerging. And for me, that's the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. So thank you, everyone. As Monica said, just wanted to share a little bit about climate action at Officeworks and how we're approaching that in, I guess, a holistic sense. First of all, just in terms of our Positive Difference Plan 2025, which, as Monica mentioned, we released quite recently. And this is really about setting our next commitments over the next 5 years across people and planet. And with respect to climate action, 3 key commitments here around using 100% renewable electricity by 2025, reducing emissions in our supply chain, and planting 2 million trees on behalf of our customers. But obviously actions relating to circular economy and sustainable purchases also play a role in addressing climate action and reducing emissions. And really what we recognise through our plan is obviously we have a role as a business, but also that our team, our suppliers and our customers also want to contribute and take more sustainable actions. And ultimately, that's what these commitments ladder up to. Firstly, just to touch on some context around where we've been as a business when we look at climate action. So back in 2016, we developed our first long-term sustainability strategy, and as part of that set a target to reduce emissions of our own operations by 20% by 2020. This was largely through energy efficiency initiatives. So the installation of LED lighting on our shop floor and building energy management systems. And as you can see, by 2019, most of our stores, except for one, had LED lighting. So really addressing energy efficiency in the first instance. But at the same time, we launched Restoring Australia in 2017, and that's our 2-for-1 tree planting program, which is really about giving customers an easy way to take sustainable actions just by purchasing paper products at Officeworks. In 2018, we transitioned our business fleet into hybrid vehicles, which emit 53% less emissions. And in 2019, with Wesfarmers, we conducted our first climate-related disclosures as part of the TCFD recommendations. And in terms of that process, obviously the process itself was just as important as the output, because it was really about bringing a lot of stakeholders together across the business to raise climate awareness, understand the scenarios we're looking at, and what are the implications for our business into the future and decisions we have to make. And then to this year, so we exceeded our goal. We've achieved a 26% reduction of emissions over that period. And now it's really about the renewable energy rollout, starting with solar. Our approach to energy and carbon management has been quite integrated, and really recognizing that it is this intersection of risk mitigation, environmental impact, and cost management that really brings about a energy and carbon management strategy. And so from a risk, whether that is about energy security, environmental impact, clearly looking at how we can reduce our emissions supported with strategy and good governance. And from a cost perspective, managing, increasing electricity costs through the activities that we undertake. But then when you look at that intersection, so risk and environmental impact, clearly that is around reputational risk for organisations that don't look at their environment, reducing their environmental impact. And similarly, from a cost and environmental impact, energy efficiency projects, renewable energy, clean tech rebates is all about being good for business, but also good for the environment. And so you can see over the last 6 years in the chart that we are a significantly larger business than we were back in 2015. We've opened a lot more stores, but we've reduced our emissions through the energy efficiency initiatives. So looking forward for us, it is about enhancing our current energy efficiency program, but also really about the role of renewable energy. So in the first instance, we're looking at the balance of our lighting that isn't energy efficient. We've just conducted an audit and there's about 10,000 fittings across the network, which are, as you can see here, exterior lighting, tea rooms, and really that's about delivering savings as well as further reducing our emissions, but also in the likes of these exterior lights, reducing maintenance costs. So there's a really clear business case about why we would do that. The second part is optimizing our building energy management systems. With this in the majority of our stores, we're now looking at the software that will really connect these together to further optimize the energy use. And one example would be around air conditioning and how we can set rules to accommodate extreme temperatures. So if we're getting days predicted of 40 degrees, rules can be set so that our air conditioners can come on earlier in the morning to cool the stores, or we may lift the temperature in store slightly on those days to reduce the impact and pressure on the units. But really the most exciting part is just the role of renewable energy. And we're in the process now of installing 10 sites with solar power. And over the next 3 years, a further 70 stores will be completed as we work towards our goal of 100% renewable electricity. When we look at our supply chain, really for us, this is about continuing to enhance our understanding of the Scope 3 emissions in order to inform our long-term target, and also understanding our areas of influence. So as you can see on this chart here, the categories that are most material to us from an upstream perspective are really around the purchase goods and services, fuel and energy related activities, transport and waste and business travel, whilst downstream we're looking at transport and distribution, use of sold products and end of life treatment. But as you can see from our Scope 3 profile, of the 1.6 million tonnes of carbon emissions each year, about 80% of that relate to upstream goods and services through production, raw materials. And so for us, it's really about understanding what our suppliers are doing. We have some great partners in there that are already taking pretty ambitious steps, but then also further enhancing our understanding through cycle assessments and where we can start to influence outcomes. As I touched on, clearly as a retailer, customers play a really important role, and our goal with Restoring Australia is to plant 2 million trees by 2025. We've already planted 700,000, and this is a great program that is driving multiple outcomes. So we are restoring landscapes. In the image on the left there, it's about the Monaro region and replanting eucalypts that have died off and encouraging koalas to come back over time. Whilst when we look at our planting sites in Queensland, it's about restoring wetlands that are improving the water runoff and protecting the Great Barrier Reef as a result. And this is just one way, as I said, customers simply by shopping at Officeworks are playing a part in climate action. And similarly, our team, to echo John's points around the role that they play, we've got a really passionate team. And I used the waste example to highlight what we've been able to achieve. So if we look at over the last 5 years, where we've come from as part of our journey to become a zero waste business, we've reduced landfill by 66%, and we're now recycling over 90% of our waste. We have a number of stores that are actually managing their waste with a household wheelie bin. And really, we got to this point by taking the time to educate our teams. We took a number of our team members off-site and they sorted through their waste bins to really understand what the issue was so that they can address it at their store. But we've got to this point where we've got this zero waste culture, and the image there with the caption, "We don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly, we need millions of people doing it imperfectly," is one of those organic actions that have kind of come out of this across our WA teams. So the question for us is, we've taken our team on a journey, you know, how do we replicate what we're doing in waste around the climate action so that they can continue to take sustainable actions at work, but also in their life outside of work. So from my side, a couple of key points. Clearly, even with a mature energy efficiency programs ourselves, we can still further identify opportunities that are good for business and reduce emissions. We know there's various pathways to achieving 100% renewable electricity, and our initial focus is on on-site generation, but looking at keeping those options open as we continue to work towards that target over the next few years. Scope 3 emissions, absolutely, they're complex, but really that initial analysis and taking the time to get that really informs the materiality and the priorities that we can then further investigate. And finally, the climate action is a shared effort. We have a role for our team, our customers and our suppliers, and they want to be involved. We know it's important to them. So that's a wrap from me. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, Ryan. Fantastic. Lovely to hear the story, not just of the carbon story, but also the circular economy story as well. And, you know, the fact that there are trees being planted on behalf of the customers there in the very complex supply chain that you have. Just one question before we go to Carla from John. Who's your partner? Who do you partner with around the tree planting?
Yeah, it's with Greening Australia.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to have those broader conversations later. So now I'd like to introduce Carla Alzamora. Carla is Engagement Coordinator for ClimateWorks Australia, and Carla is going to talk about the fantastic tool that ClimateWorks has developed around the Zero Carbon Tracker. Thanks, over to you, Carla.
Thanks, Monica. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I'd like also to pay my respects, to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past, present, and emerging, of the lands and waters of the people of the Kulin Nation, and in particular, the Burman people of where I'm standing today. So as Monica said, I'm Carla Zamora. I am the engagement coordinator for the Net Zero Momentum Tracker. For those of you who are not familiar with ClimateWorks, we are a not-for-profit based out of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and we act as a bridge between research and action to accelerate the transition to net zero within Australia and Southeast Asia. So today I'll give you an overview of the Net Zero Momentum Tracker. We'll talk about what is a strong commitment. We'll see how we go about our methodology and some of our findings, some emerging trends from our assessment, and some tips and recommendations of how you can get started. So the goal of the Net Zero Momentum Tracker is to normalize net zero by 2050 targets and strategies within the Australian economy. And we do that by assigning a net zero ambition rating to organizations and publishing them on sectoral reports and on our website, netzerotracker.org. While these reports represent a moment in time, the website is a more dynamic tool where we can update the information as companies raise their ambitions. And we've been doing that so far. So we've analyzed over 170 organizations from the property, retail, local government, banking, and superannuation sectors, and found that around 30% of them have commitments aligned with net zero by 2050. So next year, we're looking into how we can use this baseline as a pre-COP deliverable to showcase momentum, highlight the drivers, and signal how we can accelerate the transition. So we don't have a full slide yet, as John did in his presentation with logos, but we'll get there. So these are the organizations that have net zero targets by 2050 from our assessment, and will soon be adding more as we publish the reports for the resources sectors in December, energy retailers and generators, and manufacturing reports both first quarter next year. So why are targets important? Yeah, setting a net zero target is central to our theory of change, and it has a transformative effect because it means that you're shifting your mindset from incremental forward planning to backcasting. And by doing that, from our own experience, you can you can completely shift the company's perspective and raise the ambition of climate action. It also encourages companies and organizations to conduct the assessment of their pathways options, which will prevent them of getting locked into high-risk, climate-vulnerable business models. It also allows them to identify gaps and direct R&D. And by supporting innovation, it can help them accelerate their transition even more. So what is a strong commitment? One that's aligned with the Paris Agreement and in line with the IPCC recommendations. So first and foremost, a strong commitment must reflect the need to decarbonize and the pathway to get there. So you must have a net zero by or before 2050 target, which is supported by shorter term interim targets and supported also accompanied by a strategy, a plan that signal how these commitments are going to be achieved. So our assessment is informed by this definition. And how do we assess organizations? So we start by selecting the top 20-ish organizations, the top emitters in a sector based on the emissions reported to ANGA, or depending on the sector, a suitable financial criteria such as market capitalization. We then gather publicly available information regarding commitments and reductions activities for their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And that is typically from annual and financial reports, sustainability reports, and pledges such as Science-Based Targets Initiative. We then categorize these activities within 4 pillars: energy conservation, renewable electricity, electrification, and fuel switching, and non-energy related emissions. That's where offsets come in. And we give each of these pillars a rating. So this detailed analysis then informs the assessment of the overall net zero ambition of an organization. So you can see here an overview of our 6 sector reports so far and in relation to the ratings that we give them. So our analytical framework rates them as fully aligned, which is our gold standard, when a company has net zero by 2050 target for all its emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3, accompanied by a strategy and or interim targets. Closely aligned organizations have a net zero that covers a significant proportion of their emissions, accompanied by strategy and or interim targets. Aligned aspiration pathway means that there is an aspiration to achieve net zero by 2050 or an interim target. Partially aligned, there is a net zero by 2050 target for a small proportion of the emissions. Not aligned, that means that organizations are undertaking activities to reduce emissions intensity, but not in line with net zero. And no targets when we couldn't find any publicly available information. And we see huge potential in these numbers. Since we published the reports, we've already seen movement from the companies, and we are in the process of updating the reports or updating the website. So you can see here, this first line would be the updated number that we have now, and then report, update, report, update, report. So you can see there is an increasing ambition. So let's look at a sector. So it's still not all the updates are in the website, so we're still in the process of doing that. So looking at each sector for property, of the 21 major companies, property companies that we assessed, 90% of them had emissions reductions targets, and over a third had net zero commitments. For local government, over a third of them, representing 1/5 of the Australian population, have made commitments to reach net zero community emissions, and more than half of them are acting on reducing their direct emissions. For banks and investors, we can see them increasingly taking steps to decarbonize their portfolios, and by contrast, transport and retail are the ones that are falling behind and seems to still have a long way to go before aligning to net zero by 2050. So what's next? From this assessment, we can see some emerging trends. The first one our assessment indicates is an emerging focus on scope 3 emissions, and we could see that from Ryan's presentation just now. And that is happening mainly through engagement with customers and suppliers, and in the case of financial institutions, some investees. So we've seen Movers has a specific target for Scope 3. BHP and Fortescue have committed for reducing 40% in the emissions from their shipping. Cbus, UniSuper, and HESTA all are conducting activities to engage with their investees to reduce their emissions. And back to BHP, they also announced a 30% reduction, the goal to help the steel industry reduce 30% their emissions. And that leads us to a second trend, which is collaboration and alliances. A big proportion of the companies that the organizations that we assessed that have net zero targets are joining alliances and collaborating across value chains. We have only some examples here, and I'm sure you can think of many others. So the Australian Energy Transition Initiative, which ClimateWorks is one of the conveners, it exists to help hard-to-abate sectors move towards net zero. Responsible Steel is an industry standard and certification initiative that has members from all stages of the steel supply chain. And then we go to the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, Climate Action 100+, the Climate League 2030, and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance is all investor-related initiatives, and which leads us to the third trend, which is the movement from investors. So we can see that these alliances have a huge potential to have a knock-on effect across the entire economy. So they represent trillions of US dollars in assets under management, and it means that they are increasingly seeing climate change as an issue that presents financial risks. We also see new financing solutions emerging. An example, transition bonds that are supporting brown coal assets in the transition to net zero. And also financing principles and frameworks helping supporting hard-to-abate sectors to make the transition. For example, the Poseidon Principles, who provides a benchmark for what it means to be a good bank in the maritime sector. So it's not a matter of ideology anymore. It's clear that they see these as just making economic sense. So I'll finish by giving a few recommendations of how you can start or accelerate your transition to net zero. First one is ensure buy-in from the executive leadership. It's clear that climate change is a fiduciary duty and should be on the list of priorities of your CEO. Second one, understand and define your own scopes 1, 2, and 3 boundaries, particularly your most material source of emissions. 3, explore options and pathways to net zero through scenario analysis, because these will enable you to map where the opportunities are. Explore relevant tools and methodologies. The Science Based Targets Initiative is a good example and has become global standard for companies, especially setting interim targets in specific sectors. And 5th, look at what is best practice within your sector. Set the bar high. We understand that incorporating net zero targets in corporate strategy can be challenging, and ClimateWorks is currently working on a business toolkit to support business make strong climate commitments and strong climate actions. You hear more about that soon. And to finalize, if there's one key message that I want you to take from this presentation, is that by setting targets now, you are creating the context in which those commitments become realizable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. That was really engaging to hear, that level of collaboration, the Scope 3 piece, but also that momentum that's being driven by investors. So we've heard from John Dee talk about the RE100 presentation, RE100 and the opportunity for companies to make the commitment. We've heard from Ryan and Officeworks and how a company is really driving that leadership piece. Parla, ClimateWorks, the Net Zero Momentum Tracker, really showing that there is momentum. And now I'd like to introduce Karen Williams, who's the business reform leader for the Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. And Karen is going to speak a little bit about the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is quite a mouthful, TCFD. I guess it's a little bit about how it's influenced companies to help lift the hood, so to speak, on some of the businesses, and how it's really driven momentum for companies grappling with their climate risk. So over to you, Karen. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think the slides will hopefully be popping up soon, but I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of Australia and their continued connection with the land, waterways, communities, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Mulgara people of the Darug Nation in Western Sydney. So could I jump to the next slide, please? So the reason why I think this is useful is it explains the context, I guess, where some of the TCFD and some of the momentum we're seeing is coming from. Basically, the language has changed, and Mark Carney, who was at the time the Governor of the Bank of England, kicked it off in a speech to Lloyd's of London when he described climate change as the tragedy of the horizons, being the longer you leave it, the more costly it becomes. And what I guess Mark Carney's sort of action at that time did in terms of setting up the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, because he was the chair of the G20 at the time, but it was really shifting that conversation away from climate change being something that's purely environmental, and you would think that it threatening our existence was something that would get people's attention. But ultimately, what's got the attention is when we start talking about the impact that it's going to have on the economy as well. And that's where I think we've seen quite a lot of the momentum that I'll go through now is actually through that lens. So we skip to the next slide, please. So we're seeing quite a lot of headlines coming through, a number in Australia, the Australian government being sued by a student over the financial risks of climate change, obviously the super fund Rest being sued, and obviously that's now been settled. Commonwealth Bank were sued a couple of years back over inadequate climate disclosure. The shareholders did drop that when the Commonwealth Bank did agree to do TCFD disclosures. And we're also seeing some push overseas. So EasyJet were among 4 firms that Client Earth reported to the audit watchdog in the UK. So that's the Financial Reporting Council. And each of them was audited by one of the big 4 accounting firms as well. And so there were questions raised around why were these organisations not disclosing climate risk appropriately? Now, EasyJet had a sustainability report, but it wasn't actually looking at it from a climate risk perspective. So if we skip to the next slide, I'm just going to give a brief overview of TCFD and what it's sort of aiming to do. So as I mentioned, Mark Carney established this Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, back in December 2015. And it was set up under the Financial Stability Board of the G20. So it was really with the remit of how climate change can impact on financial stability and global financial stability, chaired by Michael Bloomberg, and the recommendations came out in June of 2017. Now, they're a set of recommended disclosures. They're voluntary at this stage, but we are seeing jurisdictions now looking to mandate them. So New Zealand in September, I think the end of September, announced that their intention to mandate TCFD, and we've also seen the UK just last week or the week before also announcing their intention around making TCFD disclosures mandatory in their jurisdiction. They are intended to go into the financial filings, and this is where we get into that sort of economy. It's bringing it into that mainstream report. The TCFD itself was targeting on the financial sector and high risk non-financial sectors, so transportation, energy, resources, etc. It splits between the risks associated with the transition according to climate change, and also the physical risks. So when we're looking at transition risk, we're looking at those policy and legal risks, so some of the risk of litigation and the changing I guess, policy environment that in terms of the government, we're looking at the technology risks, market risks, and reputation type of risks. And then with the physical risks, and this is the other side of it, I guess, the acute and the chronic risks associated with climate change for the business. So this is very much from the lens of the external climate environment and the impact it will have on the organisation. It's not to say that the organisation needs to take any action, but obviously once you actually properly understand the risks and start reporting on those risks, most organisations, if those risks are material, are going to want to take action, because that's how the sort of governance process works. And I think what TCFD sought to do was to really create a better understanding and a better framework for how those risks can actually be framed and disclosed. Because for a number of times within sort of reporting side of it, there was a lack of general awareness and understanding of the impacts of climate change, and so there was limited disclosure. It's also looking to create a degree of consistency in that disclosure by setting some principles-based and high-level disclosures. Those 4 areas there, the governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, are the kind of 4 key pillars. And then underneath those, there are a number of sort of recommended disclosures. One of the key things that gets a lot of attention is the scenario analysis component, which is within the strategy. And what's that looking to do is look at, okay, if you take an organization's strategy, how will that be impacted by different potential climate scenarios? It's not about a forecast, but they are potential outcomes in terms of a climate situation, and stress testing, I guess, the strategy against those. It's intended, it said there, to go short, medium, and longer term. So taking a longer term focus beyond, I guess, what would be a typical business sort of strategic horizon. And it's going to be a set of qualitative and quantitative. So it's not all just about metrics and what's your greenhouse gas emissions, but actually how are you incorporating climate risk into your governance processes and into risk management? And those are probably the 2 core things. If you haven't actually thought about it and brought it into your governance and risk management processes, then you're probably not in a position to determine how material it is to your organisation. Likewise, then it goes into the strategy and so forth. And I'll skip to the next slide because that's obviously a good point to do so. So what I was going to look at here in terms of developments within Australia is just to give an overview of, I guess, what we have seen coming through that's really, I guess, creating that momentum that has been mentioned earlier. So actually predating the TCFD was the Hutley legal opinion. So Noel Hutley QC produced a legal opinion in 2016, which was around climate change and directors' duties. It was prepared by Minter Ellison for the Centre for Policy Development and the Future Business Council. And it specifically noted that climate change risks would be regarded by a court as being foreseeable at the present time. So this got over that hurdle that we'd had that, I guess, climate change, it's happening far too in the future. It's not something that directors need to be considering. And the opinion did actually go on to say that it's conceivable that directors who fail to consider climate change risks could now be found liable for breaching their duty of care and diligence in the future. So this came out in Australia in October 2016. This was actually updated in February of last year following these announcements that I'll go through now by the RBA, APRA and ASIC to really sort of say that with these announcements that have come out from the regulators and standard setters, there's actually even more of, I guess, a momentum around it and a requirement for directors to be looking at this. So the RBA and APRA have both put out statements that are really, so the RBA has acknowledged that climate change will have a deep economic impact, so it's getting back to that economic perspective, and also acknowledged that the earlier policymakers and businesses take action to address climate change, the lower the economic costs are. And I think, Monica, you mentioned that something earlier around earlier comments in the sessions before, which commented on that the sooner we take action, the lower cost it will be. And so we've had the RBA come out and say something similar. APRA's been supportive of the TCFD and climate change and their supervision activities over those prudentially regulated entities, so the sort of banks and super funds and so forth. They're actually looking at how those organisations that they regulate are actually assessing climate change risks and integrating that into their ongoing supervisory activities. ASIC, so the corporate regulator, back in 2018, they looked at the climate disclosures of top Australian companies and gave some findings that basically said that directors and their advisors and listed companies needed to adopt a more proactive approach to emerging risks, which includes climate. and actually how they can maintain strong and effective corporate governance, complying with the law and disclosing meaningful and useful climate risk related information to the investors. And they mentioned the TCFD in that. They also last year updated their regulatory guide on what should be disclosed within prospectuses, and also the operating and financial review to specifically refer to climate change and the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. The ASX, in their latest edition of the Corporate Governance Principles and Recommendations, they have gone on to say that listed entities should disclose any material exposure to environmental or social risks. And in their commentary, they specifically mention encourage entities to consider whether they have a material exposure to climate change risk and reference the recommendations of the TCFD, and if they do have a material exposure, to actually make the disclosures recommended by the TCFD. We've also got the Climate Change Authority. So their report at the beginning of the year, February 2020, which was prospering in a low emissions world. That report had a number of recommendations to help Australia transition to a low emissions future. And one of those actually included a recommendation for a joint task force of the Council of Financial Regulators to actually examine the phasing in and mandatory reporting of climate related risks and mainstream climate related disclosures in companies' audited financial statements. So we're seeing this significant push around corporate disclosure of climate related risks. And if you could just skip to the last slide, please. And then the one final, I guess, piece in the puzzle was the Australian Accounting Standards Board and Auditing Standards Board. So I guess it's coming from a chartered accountants. This is, you know, our sort of space very much. But what we saw here were the auditing and accounting standard setters basically saying, well, at what point should these disclosures not just sit within a company's annual report, but actually move into the financial statements themselves? And what they were looking at was, I guess, how investors have actually been very clear in their expectations that they want to see disclosures in relation to climate risk. And so their flowchart very much goes down the line of, if you're an entity operating in an industry where there is an investor expectation that climate related risks, and that they expanded it to other emerging risks as well, but could affect the disclosures, then you need to disclose something, even if it's to say we've looked at it and it's not going to have an impact. And they also provided some guidance on actually ensuring that auditors as well are thinking about how they should be incorporating climate related risk into their audit processes. Now, both of those pieces coming out from Australia, and Australia was leading the way in this by putting this out back in December 2018. Last year, the International Accounting Standards Board was inspired by the AASB and then produced their own statement in terms of how climate-related risk should be incorporated into companies' financial statements. And that's getting a lot of attention at the moment in the Northern Hemisphere as they go through their reporting season. Likewise, the International Auditing Standards Board has put out similar guidance on the application of auditing standards to climate-related risks. So we're seeing significant momentum and a significant push around this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. It's so good to hear that Australian, sort of thought leadership has really made a difference in this area as well. So now we're going to open it up to Q&A. For those of you who have any questions, please put that in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will moderate those questions. So I guess I want to come to John with a few of your questions here. I was trying to work out what the 4.5 terawatt hours per year is, but I couldn't work that out. I'll come back to that later. So I guess one of the things that you mentioned was the power of collaborating and partnerships and how important that is, and the ability to influence each other. And I guess I'd be keen to hear how competitive and how collaborative the RE100 members are, and what trends are you seeing in that area as well?
That's a good question. I think basically when you look at our membership, some members are further along their journey than others. Some members can call upon international expertise from overseas, where they've already maybe achieved their 100% renewables target. And what we find is that the companies are incredibly helpful towards each other. So if we have a new member coming on board, or maybe, for example, we have a really major company join recently, and they had before they joined us, they had 2 meetings with one of our members to get their heads around PPAs in Australia. And this particular organization, who's a member of ours, had done some excellent work in that area. And so the questions about legals that they could help with, they could take them through the whole, how do you go about getting a PPA? What were the learnings they had? What were the things to look out for? And so the collaboration has been absolutely fantastic. And that's one of the things I think that attracts a lot of companies to RE100, is that if you're coming on board, and say, for example, you've got some operations in Indonesia, we've got some people, you know, over there, or members over there, looking at how that can be improved on the access to renewables. Korea is another one, another country in this region where some of our members have sought advice on how to deal with renewables, you know, going 100% renewable in Korea. And so in that instance, we're actually working with the government and giving advice to them, and working and collaborating with them on ensuring that whatever system is put in place in Korea meets the needs of the members of RE100, because if it works for our members, it will work for all corporates. So the collaboration between members is extremely good. The collaboration, positive collaboration with governments behind the scenes is good. I think the fact that we're not politically, you know, we don't go and do campaigns that are politically driven, I think helps make companies feel secure with us as well. And I think it's a safe zone, I think, for companies who want to find out and ask questions that they may not want to admit publicly they don't know the answer to. RE100 provides a safe place to do that.
Thanks. And Karen, what's been your experience in organisations kind of trying to collaborate around setting best practice principles for TCFD? Because, you know, if I recall, it's not that long ago that companies were first grappling with their, you know, what does TCFD mean for me? What's the first report that I need to make? You know, trying to gather that information, even to try and develop some metrics around it. So I'd be interested to hear what trends you've seen in terms of that sort of collaborating on that different information that organisations have.
Thanks. Look, I think it's something that we're starting to see different industry groups working together and trying to get, I guess, ahead of the curve. So in Australia, I've been part of the Climate Measurement Standards Initiative. So that was a lot of the financial sector, so the banks, the insurers, asset managers, and investors coming together to think about how they could specifically unpack scenario analysis for the physical risks of climate change on physical assets. So it was quite a narrow sort of starting point, but really trying to come up with, well, what's the science around the physical impacts in Australia, and then also thinking about it. And the part I was more involved in was actually, what does that mean for the disclosure? And so what we're seeing in other jurisdictions are the sort of, for example, in the UK, the Bank of England, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, is starting to say, well, this is the kind of scenarios that we want you to do, and this is how we want you to do it. In Australia, we're seeing it at the moment, the industry is starting to lead that through this Climate Measurement Standards Initiative, and actually starting to look at that themselves and say, what are the ways we can do it? And by keeping it, I guess, open source, which it is, and it's also been a very collaborative approach with both the users of the information as well as with the preparers. I think we're trying to come up with sort of a standardized approach as best you can. And I think that's a really sort of positive direction of actually sort of industries working together to meet that criteria, which is around, you know, we want the sort of comparability and consistency of information, while still knowing that every organisation is a little bit different, and how we can unpack that. And so there were certainly some interesting discussions when we were looking at, for example, asset lives and exploring that between an insurer and a financial bank, and how they probably view the same asset is actually with a different asset life depending on, because of how their business model works. So actually trying to get some consistency around that information, I think, has been really positive. And I'd certainly been encouraging other industry sort of groups to actually look at how they can also probably work together, and actually sort of, I guess, unpack some of the TCFD aspects for their particular sector.
Thank you. And I guess over to you, Ryan. You know, part of what you're seeking to do with the 2 Million Trees program, and, you know, educating your customers and getting access to information around supply chain, that collaboration piece. So I'd be interested in, I guess, what some of the challenges are for engaging the customers that come into your store, some of the opportunities for messaging around this, and how you're seeing that translate into sort of everyday benefits for the company.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose from the customer perspective, we know that they tell us quite often, either through feedback or through research that we undertake, that they do want to shop more sustainably. But our role is really around addressing those barriers, which is, make it easy. How do I find the most sustainable product? Make it affordable. So, let's not, which is a challenge, particularly, when we're talking recycled content. And then don't compromise on the quality. So we've done a lot of work recently to bring a lot more products to market, and we've just launched our Greener Choices initiative, which is very much around helping navigation, so customers can find those products easily online, on packaging when in store. And back to school, we're pretty excited about some of the new ranges, which are like for like products, whether it's recycled notebooks, but at the same price parity. So that's a big step forward, and I guess one of the ways that we're trying to make more sustainable products become more mainstream. But more broadly, I think just how we make that experience engaging, and a lot of work we do now when you walk into our stores, we've got the recycling station very front and center, where you can drop off pens, batteries, etc., and also some of the impact stories that we're achieving through our partnerships. So yeah.
Fantastic. And Carla, to you talked a lot about how you're starting to see companies ramping up. And I'd be interested to, I'd be interested to hear a little bit about what you think it's going to take for companies to move from being partially aligned to fully aligned. What are some of the key drivers that are going to be making that shift occur?
Hi, I think, so can you repeat the question, Monica? Sorry, one of those Zoom moments where I had a postman knocking on my door and I couldn't hear you.
It happens. I've got a cat that's still sleeping, thankfully. So I guess, we're starting to see some momentum shifting, but there's still quite a few companies on the graph that you showed that where they're either not aligned or partially aligned. And what do you think it's going to take to get the companies fully aligned around the net zero?
Well, from the companies, we can give examples from the companies that have already made that move, and what made them move from one category to the other is having a more comprehensive target. So they were initially targeting Scope 1 and focusing on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then they made a more comprehensive commitment to encompass also their Scope 3 emissions. That's a big change, and that is something that companies, that we hope to see many more companies doing it. So it's from investors, they have targets that only relate to a small proportion of their investments, and then they make it a commitment that's absolute zero emissions. That would definitely move them up the scale, and that's basically the same with across all sectors. For local governments, we see that the majority of them are conducting any actions or many actions and activities that are targeted at reducing their emissions, but they are not sufficient to achieve net zero. And the only way that they can see that is if they do the scenario analysis, if they do the backcasting, which you think it's a huge difference in how you think. So you see where you want to get there and where you are now, and then you trace that plan. Because if you keep doing incremental change and incremental planning year to year based on your current context, you won't have the same understanding of the scale of change you need to bring onto your organization in order to get there.
So knowing that direction of travel, setting those ambitious targets, but also collecting that data, and that Scope 3 piece, of course, is the hardest piece. And for most organizations, that's, their Scope three, purchase goods and services category is a really complex supply chain where they've got to get some understanding of that. So Ryan, if you're willing to share, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you went, got a very complex business with complex supply chains, how you're working with your supply chain. Obviously you've got new products coming in, new product lines, how you're seeking to engage them and involve them in the journey that you're undertaking at Officeworks at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I think firstly, we're starting from a really good place with our supply base because we have concluded the first 5-year strategy. So they've already been on a journey with us around reducing environmental impacts more broadly. So I suppose for us, that evolution and when we start talking around climate action and emissions within the supply chain, as I said, many of them have already made significant commitments, as you would expect from some of the large international brands. For us, it's just understanding who are those partners we actually need to work a bit closer with, where they can learn from us. And I think where we've been successful in a lot of the areas where we have worked with a number of our suppliers, they've seen the benefits of now being ahead of the curve, and whether that's through modern slavery legislation, ethical sourcing, or getting ahead of packaging impacts. So I think there's a really good partnership base to work from, and I think that's the opportunity for us now, is as we understand our emissions in Scope 3 and where we can, that we work with those suppliers in a meaningful way.
Yes, I noticed that one of the commitments you've made is around zero deforestation in supply chains. So, there's global momentum to make sure that that is one of the commitments that companies commit to, but it's very difficult. That tracing, tracking, verification, the independence of that verification is quite difficult to find, and I guess it's a journey, a bit like the modern slavery legislation. You've got to grapple with your first tiers and work through that. So I don't know if you've got any comments on the deforestation piece at all. And
yeah, sure. So that piece for us is really, again, evolving our current commitment to all paper products being FSC certified or 100% recycled. So we've got 10,000 products that meet that criteria and have that credible certification. But this is then saying an all-encompassing position, whether it's packaging or timber products as well, that we've got an approach there. So you're right, though, 40,000 products, it's very complex around when you start getting into that next layer. But I think we've got the good governance processes in place, which are well established. We work with third parties to do some of that supply chain mapping in the absence of certification. So we will take what we've learned to date and then replicate that through our supply chain from a risk-based perspective as we work towards that goal in the 5 years.
Yes, that language, as Karen's, that first slide you put up, Karen, that was in relation to Mark Carney. It's not just about our very existence, but it's about the economy and that risk piece. That's such an important story to be sharing. So I've got some questions here. Reflecting on the great work underway by both RE100 and ClimateWorks Net Zero Momentum Tracker, do you see 100% renewables as a step along the journey towards the net zero targets?
Yeah, well, we have renewable electricity as one of our pillars of the for decarbonization pathways. So we definitely see it as being part, and companies are rated on where they are at that journey. So we definitely do see that, John.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. I think that it definitely is a major step along the way. And I think what's important about it too is that it makes it easier to get people involved in a net zero initiative, because for the average employee, average stakeholder, average customer, going 100% renewable is far easier for someone to understand than, what is net zero? What does that involve? It's harder for someone who is not aware of the net zero initiative push. It's far easier to get people on that first step of the ladder by starting off with energy efficiency, going towards 100% renewables. as Ryan has been speaking about how to look at your supply chain and how you get those on board, that's easy for people to understand as well. But I definitely think it's a key part of that transition.
So I guess another question to Ryan, what steps do you put in place to ensure that suppliers who are supplying into your supply chain are legitimate and can avoid the greenwashing that we know customers are very concerned about?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've got some really good controls in place up front around registered products to begin with. So there's a lot of documentation. We can't bring products in until ethical, forestry, other material requirements are met and reviewed by my team. But I suppose in this space, given that there is going to be a lot more materials coming onto market that are claiming to be more sustainable, we do recognise that we have an opportunity, but also to manage that risk, to make sure the products we give to customers are very credible. And so we've been working with GECA, Good Environmental Choice Australia, on a pilot to verify and substantiate the claims that our products are making. So we've done about 60 products ranging from recycled content to plant-based plastics, and we've had all of those products endorsed with their labels. So we're now reviewing that pilot and looking at, okay, what does that look like more broadly? Because I think there is an opportunity at a product level to have a widespread industry adopted label.
Fantastic to hear that you're working with GECA. I think they're a very good organisation. So I've got some more questions coming in. I guess so what have you learned so far from your journey towards the 100% renewables commitment?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I would go back to, first of all, it's an integrated and comprehensive sustainability strategy. So the starting point for us in this next 5-year phase was we've completed a strategy that was at the time seemed ambitious, but clearly built on stakeholder feedback. We achieved or exceeded those targets. So I think already the culture within the organisation was we do need plans that need to be ambitious. It is good for business, it's good for the environment, it's what our stakeholders want. So, really that was a very positive starting point, and clearly then supporting it with the modelling and the roadmap of how we, for us, it is a combined approach. In the first instance, it is about the on-site solar generation. So we've identified 80 sites that are the most feasible. We'll obviously look at what does that look like for distribution centres or other stores as they become available. But then it's really around in front of the meter and those large-scale PPAs, what role they will play for us, and something we're looking at now. And then otherwise, LGCs, and the procurement of green energy. So yeah, that's probably where we're at with that.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you've obviously gone through the process to look at changing over your LEDs, massive savings that you've made. I mean, it makes sense, the hierarchy of energy, and then that education piece to your workers, and slowly but surely influencing people who come into your stores about what they can do, making it easy, as you said, keep it simple is the key here. So we're going to wrap up very soon. I guess I'd be keen to hear from you, Karen, for what do you see sort of is going to, if you had a crystal ball to be thinking about where these standards are going to be leading, what do you see? And we're leading, so in 2021 next year we've got the Glasgow COP coming up. There might be some moments in your timetable around particular accounting standards or things that I'm not aware of. What do you see is going to be coming up in the next 12 to 18 months that we should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few things we've got going on. As I mentioned, New Zealand have already announced the intention to mandate climate-related disclosures. So we will start to see, I think, over the next sort of 12 months, them exploring what that means and looking to develop some standards. There's also a consultation currently at the moment from the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the IFRS Foundation, and their trustees around the future of sustainability reporting as a whole. And once, I guess, that part of it concludes, part of at the moment, that they're exploring whether or not, if they do take on, I guess, global sustainability standards, and if climate should be the first one of those. So we are going to see quite significant movement, I think, in relation to climate sort of reporting standard development. A number of the sustainability standards boards are working, I understand, on a climate disclosure standard. So I guess building on the TCFD. We're also going to see a push in the run up to COP next year of more jurisdictions, I suspect, announcing mandatory TCFD in some shape or form. And so that's why these reporting standards that go with it are going to be absolutely critical. The TCFD has sort of recently released their third status report on adoption of TCFD. And I think what they're seeing is it's continuing to improve. But I think fundamentally, there's still a little bit of a gap in relation to the impact on the business model and the strategy, which is what I think the users will find most interesting, but that's at the moment probably the gap. So I think there needs to be a big push in the next sort of 12 months as we shift to this, making TCFD more mandatory and more, I guess, quasi-mandatory as we thought it was going to be anyway. And as we see that push coming through, that actually that's all well and good if people are going to disclose it, but if they don't fully understand their climate-related risks and how it will impact on their business and their strategy, then we're not going to get the right information that's going to actually inform the users of the information. So we really need to embed better understanding of climate-related risks and how the different organisations and different sectors will be impacted, so that disclosure is actually far more meaningful. So that's going to be certainly something that we're working on in this sort of coming year, I guess, in terms of how we can increase that awareness and understanding and influence that through our network of members of accountants. But I think that's something that's going to be absolutely critical in this sort of, I guess, ensuring that the momentum of travel that we've got around increased disclosure is actually still producing meaningful information, and that's going to be important as well.
And how important is sort of a good, well-developed, robust scenario analysis, and are you seeing some good examples starting to occur?
Look, I think people do get quite the scenario, I think, is part of the TCFD, but out of the sort of 11, 12 recommended disclosures, it's just one of those. So I think what we're seeing with organizations is probably the scenarios is down the pipeline in terms of their adoption of TCFD. So at the moment, I think disclosure of scenarios is still quite limited and it's still quite specific. So we've got different organizations probably putting out some examples, but they're quite, very much, okay, this is our physical risk scenario for physical assets, as opposed to, I guess, broadly testing across the board. We're probably seeing some more physical scenarios coming through. I think a lot of the initial ones were very much transition focused, and I think it's quite positive to see some of the physical scenarios coming through. But I think we're still very much at that early stages, and it's the very large organizations, probably with global reach and significant resources, who are very much actually at that point of disclosing the scenarios. And so what the next steps will be, well, I guess taking some of those information and seeing where we can get information from sort of more publicly available information that helps those smaller entities who don't have the vast resources of the large companies to actually be able to apply scenarios through that. And we might see it as well as, I guess, determining what consistent scenarios are. Certainly the larger organizations are the ones who are going to be setting that kind of standard. So it's moving, but I think scenarios are sort of just one small component of TCFD, and often organizations are trying to get their risk and their governance and even their impact on strategy in a sort of broader sense across the line before they get down to the scenario piece, because it is certainly one of the most challenging aspects of TCFD. There are some information available when TCFD, as I mentioned, it's put out its latest status report, and at the same time they also released some more guidance on conducting climate related scenarios and analysis. So they've put out some additional guidance. As I mentioned, there's the Climate Measurement Standards Initiative as well that's put out guidance, and we've also got the TCFD Good Practice Guide, which actually includes one organisation from Australia, which is the Commonwealth Bank, in terms of examples of good TCFD disclosures. So those disclosures and I guess those good practices and best practices are still evolving, and I think we'll see a lot more following the Northern Hemisphere's reporting season in December, and as we go into sort of January, February, we'll start to see some more examples coming through that can be shared, but it's certainly at the moment still at that early stages and just the very large ones who are reporting at the moment.
Fabulous. And I think I take the point that momentum will shift so that we start to see more tools available for some of the smaller companies to be responding and using those tools as well for their own climate risk analysis and assessment. So thanks very much. Carla, to you, I guess, we've heard about the momentum tracker. You're assessing the different sectors. So what do you see coming up in the next 12 to 18 months? And, including any thoughts you have in the lead up to the Glasgow COP next year.
So we really hope to see more happening. We think that the momentum that we started seeing the past 12 months, I think that will be increased in the following 12. I think we had something that I heard in a meeting this week, that what we had in the past 12 months, in the past few years, is not reflecting what we will see in the following year. So we are trying to use what we build as a baseline, as I said, to build a pre-COP deliverable to showcase this momentum and to showcase that this is not more a matter of asking if or why to join the transition, but asking how you can join the transition. And I think that we can see more and more companies starting to ask how they can join the transition.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carla. And over to you, Ryan. I guess as a big company with a big footprint across all parts of Australia and touching various different sectors, I'd be keen to hear from you. What's your message to corporate Australia and to suppliers and to customers of Officeworks on how they can get on board to, do their fair share?
Yeah, sure. So, I think for us, it's quite exciting having this new strategy out there and obviously being more ambitious and looking to accelerate our progress. So it is really about, bringing our stakeholders along. I would say, from our plan and the actions, the business case has never been clearer from all aspects about why it's good for business and good for people and the planet. So I think that would be one of the key messages. And also that, really what I'm seeing is that tension between traditional competition really blurring with collaboration. And that's where we're getting some really unique and innovative partnerships. And that's, I think what's quite exciting in the year ahead as well. So yeah. I might just, I know there was a question out there from John just on VicForest, just to cover that one off, John. It's a good question. And, we've continued to work towards our target for FSC in December this year. And as part of that, we were really pleased that copy paper was FSC certified in March, which included Reflex. So we have transitioned out of VicForest. And I think, just on that, we established a target in 2015, and it goes to that point of long-term targets where you can influence outcomes. And we were really happy with where we landed earlier this year.
Can I just say as well, I've been following that really closely, what you've been doing there. Your leadership at Officeworks has been absolutely fantastic on that front. And I just want to thank you publicly for that. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks, John.
Yeah, well done. That's a very good outcome all around. And finally, to you, John, what do you see on the horizon for companies signing up to RE100 and generally, I guess, you've got your finger on the pulse. We've got 12 months until the Glasgow COP. We want to be seeing, the UK government's made it pretty clear that they want to be driving ambition. We've had Boris on the phone to our Prime Minister. We've got Macron also, engaging in the region here. He's really helped to get China to make commitments around them being carbon neutral before the end of 2060. So, keen to hear your views on what you're going to see over the next 12 months or so.
I think it's going to be incredibly exciting because if you think about it, we've now got 15 companies have signed up to RE100. And needless to say, I'll be chatting to Ryan as soon as possible after this to see if we can get Officeworks into RE100 because you're doing such great work. Have to get that out there, mate. Very keen to get you in the team. But basically, I think if you look at Woolworths, I mean, it's very exciting that they've got on board. I think that really has captured people's imagination. You know, a company that's got 3,500 retail outlets that use 1% of Australia's power, sending that really positive message out there to go 100% renewable, joining up with RE100. And I think that coming together of so many major companies, as I said, we have 267 now, 268 actually, members. And they're the biggest brands in the world that people, you know, buy from, collaborate with, you know, use on a daily basis. And I think we have helped to create, our members have helped to create a tipping point, I think is the best way of putting it, where, you know, we don't get involved in politics, but there are some politicians around the world who have really pushed back as much as possible against sustainability and circular economy and renewable energy. And I think what major companies are helping here, the major businesses that are doing this, they are making it easier for other companies to do that. It sends a really clear message to politicians that actually, you know what, you may say it's bad for business and renewable energy is a wrecking ball for the economy. But when you have, we've had so many of the RE100 members now saying, actually, we're saving a very large amount of money by going renewable, and that this is good for the bottom line. And sustainability is good for the bottom line. And as we've seen with Ryan, you know, Officeworks are working in partnership with their supply chain to make sure that customers get what they want in terms of the same quality products at the right price, performing just as good, but without the same impact on the environment. Apple, one of our members, is doing the same. Next week, if people want to tune into my interview with Lisa Jackson, she talks about how Apple has reached out to their supply chain, and they've now got 70 of their company, their supplier companies have now joined them in committing to go 100% renewable. So I think the leadership from people like the RE100 membership, like companies like Officeworks, it sends a really positive message to politicians that actually, you know what, it's now safe to make that jump into a more sustainable future, because business have gone there, they've checked it out, and it's good for business, you know, and I'm sure Ryan would agree with me here. I think it's, you know, going forward, businesses want to be sustainable, their customers want them to be sustainable, staff, stakeholders, suppliers, everyone is part of the same team now. And the more of us that are doing it, the quicker we'll get there to create the sustainable future that our kids need.
Thank you very much, John. Agreed. I'm always heartened to hear from people who are in business and really making a difference to making the world a better place. And I'd like to thank you, John, Ryan, Karen and Carla, for putting time into coming and speaking to us today. We have recorded this webinar. It will be available on the Better Futures Australia website for others to access as they wish and they want. So before I depart, I want to talk to you all the call to action. So Better Futures Australia, please visit our website. Lisa's going to put it in the chat. Please sign our declaration. Tell people who you know that we support ambitious, that you support ambitious climate change. Share your story on the website. We really want to get other organisations and individuals on board, and, you know, get involved in our collaborative climate action and advocacy. And we have more webinars and discovery sessions coming up in the city space, in the built environment space, and also for land and sustainable agriculture. And we really look forward to you contributing next year as we build momentum towards our forum in 2021. So that's it from me. And again, thank you very much, and talk to you again later. Bye for now.